while to get on board with it, much to the chagrin of those who were very eager to make plans. And it actually took me a while to figure out my own ambivalence. But over time, I came to realize so often these kind of events are nothing more than looking back over the good old days. What Bruce Springsteen sometimes refers to as the glory days. It's a little bit like going to your high school reunion. You know, it's nice to reminisce for a while, but if you get stuck in those glory days, then you're not really living in the present. And that is so far from what I think of this day as being that I really had trouble getting on board. But over time, I began to realize why it is important to take time to celebrate and to appreciate. For one thing, many of you have come here and you have just poured yourself into this ministry. And so it's hard to believe there was a time when you weren't here. But for most of you, there was a time like that. So it's a little bit, I think, like marrying into a family who, of course, have their own traditions and they have the stories that they always tell. And part of you being grafted into the family is that you begin to make those traditions your own. And these are the stories that you now share. Not to mention the fact that we're all getting a little older and we do have a tendency to forget. How many times did you lose your cell phone or your keys this past week? And so perhaps remembering a little bit about how we got here can remind us how to be church today. So it was Diane Craig who first came up with the theme for this day, Many Hands, and I think it's a good one. Because as I've looked back over 20 years of annual reports, it is obvious how many have contributed to the vitality of this congregation. And that includes the names of so many people that we read at the very beginning, names that many of you will shake for the first time when they welcome you into the church triumphant on the other side of the river. And I have to confess that I had some fun thinking about those conversations this past week. I thought, for example, of Sid Schultz, this dapper gentleman, him and his wife Marge. He was the chair of our Building and Grounds Committee for years, and so I imagined him having a conversation with Mike Van Hoff, our current chair of Building and Grounds, shaking hands, looking each other in the face, and Sid saying, "I can't believe that boiler is still going. How have you jerry-rigged it? Is it passing any inspections, or are you slipping somebody $5 in the door when they come in?" So I thought about Frank Benny, who used to sit right back where Heather Hamlin is sitting now, always on the corner, most of the time was awake during the sermons. Frank used to take care of the flowers out here in the East parking lot, and I imagined a conversation between him and Dick Roberts, who does such a beautiful job with the flowers now, and saying, "You know, Dick, the roses are pretty good, but how come you don't get that young minister to lug the wheelbarrows full of dirt like I did?" Or I thought of John Jones, volunteer choir director for 30 years. Little conversation with Diane Craig saying, "You know, it's great. You know, we have 3 times as many people in worship as we did then. But, like, what's with the guitars and the drums? Don't you know that nothing sacred was ever written after the 1600s? No, they will all look at you and they will say thanks. And you will look them back in the eye and you will say right back at you, thank you for allowing the gospel of Jesus Christ to be preached and to be proclaimed on this little corner of God's world." Tom Hudgel was an elder here for many years, head of the men's club, and years ago he wrote what's called, in Presbyterian circles, a self-study of the congregation. It's kind of an assessment of where the congregation is and a little bit about the community it finds itself in. So I just wanted to read to you a few words from the 1988 self-study. "The status of our church has largely followed the trends predicted. Our numbers have decreased. Our average age has increased. The character of our surrounding community has not changed much in the past decade, and continues to be a rather unfavorable place for the recruitment of new members to a Presbyterian church. A politically correct way, I think, of saying it's too Catholic. The present level of giving, congregational giving, pledges in 1990 were $51,000, is probably not high enough to support a full-time minister at the income level required by the presbytery. A subtle way, I think, of saying the presbytery pays its ministers too much. At the time, Greenfield had a part-time interim minister, Bill Jones, who would come in twice a week from Howell. Prior to 1988, the study continues, the number of new members received per year had not declined nearly as much as the total membership, which I think was meant to sound encouraging. As would be expected from our declining membership and aging congregation, our church school enrollment has also declined. It should be noted that 51% of our current membership is 65 years or older, and 68% is 55 or older. In other words, there were wonderful, wonderful people here, but like so many congregations, our church 20 years ago was slowly dying. Over 50% of the churches in this country have memberships of less than 100. Many, many hands took part in helping this church be reborn. When I think of many hands coming together, the first image that comes to my mind is an event back in the spring of, I think it was 1992 or 1993. You need to understand that within 3 years we had 100 new members here. And many of them didn't live in the immediate too Catholic neighborhood, and so they always drove. And so we needed a new parking lot to the north. We put it in, we thought we'd put a little grassy area between the parking lot and the building, and we would landscape around it so that there would be a place for picnics and ice cream socials and 20,000 things that we just saw pictures of. And so the area to the north was nothing but a gravel parking lot. So we pushed all of the gravel up to the west end along Greenfield Road, what is now known as the berm, and we planted all of those pine trees. Those pine trees were less than 5 feet tall. I was thinking that if I am alive to tell the story again 20 years from now, I'll say that they were seeds that we planted. The ground was so hard, the gravel was so hard, we had to rent jackhammers to make the holes for those pine trees. If you want a symbol of the unlikelihood of our rebirth, you could go out and look at those pine trees now that are so much taller than any one of us. Anyway, so we called this little project the Greening of Greenfield. Catchy little name. And on one spring morning, an army of Greenfielders showed up to plant these new shrubs and trees. Now, one of the things that happens when you have 100 new members come into a church with all of these new cockamamie ideas is that you wind up with not one congregation, but 2 congregations. If you have ever been through a church merger, you know something about this. Trust does not just happen. So in those days, we had what was referred to as the old people and the new people. And they were sometimes referred to as Peter's people in the parking lot. It wasn't about how old you were, it was about how long you had been here. The 2 had not quite become one, as we say in marriage counseling. But this project was one of the things that God used to make that happen. Because that spring morning, it rained. And I don't mean it drizzled, it poured. The north area here was so muddy we had to put down planks to push the wheelbarrows from one side to the other. So here comes Jim McCaddy, that would be Dave's dad, who was a great tenor and strong as an ox and could work me into the ground. Here comes George Demery, Vi's husband, this wonderful Irishman with a great brogue and no quit in him. And he's working alongside like Richard Stonehouse, who was at the time still a rookie, and Dick and Josh Roberts, and many of you sitting out there. And all of this is going on. All of the New people are looking at these old people, and they're thinking, it's really good. They're getting on board with this new project. And all of the old people are looking at the new people who are working really hard in the pouring rain, and they're thinking, well, maybe they're not so bad after all. And many hands right there in the mud, becoming one body. I had another image that came to mind along that. 1997. We decided we needed to make some capital improvements. The sanctuary needed a new roof. We needed some new equipment down in the kitchen, which is all old now. And most importantly, we needed to put in a new organ so that when Diane got here 2 years later, she would have a nicer instrument to play. So we decided we would raise $180,000 in a campaign that was called the Sharon Tomorrow Today campaign, which was a big deal for a congregation that prior to that was shrinking and had all of $50,000 in its pledges. So we held a big kickoff dinner. It was someplace over on Orchard Lake Road, and everybody came. Everybody came. Now prior to this, if you've been through a capital fund drive, you know that the committee goes out and asks some people to make their pledges in advance. And so we all show up that night, and there's a centerpiece on every table. And during the course of the meal, everyone at every table is to scribble a little note on the piece of paper estimating how much do you think may have been pledged prior to this evening. And I didn't go around to every table, but ours was representative. And at our table, the biggest number was $25,000, and I wrote that down. So when John Scott Stewart, young John Scott Stewart, and a guy by the name of Steve Avery stood up at the end of the meal and announced that nearly $100,000 had been pledged, people wept. Old people, new people, shook their heads, and they just cried. And when you stop and think that 10 years later, we gathered for a similar dinner, and this time pledged to raise $485,000 to build this and to make the building handicap accessible, you get an idea how many hands it has taken. But it's not just many hands or even many committed hands, because the truth is there are committed people in many shrinking congregations that are not reborn. So I just want to share with you two things about these hands that I think have been very special and continue to be. First of all, these hands have always demonstrated an exceptional willingness to try new things and to take a risk. It began in the mid-'80s when the congregation decided to sell 3 plots of land to the north for $37,000. It's now worth over $200,000 on the tax rolls. And to use that money to invest in calling a full-time pastor for all of 3 years. It would have been much easier to simply use that money, put it in the bank, call a part-time pastor, and allow him or her to come in and slowly bury the congregation. But they didn't choose to do that. And that cost them a lot of time and a lot of effort, because the truth is it is a lot harder to be part of a growing, risking, vital congregation than it is to be part of a dying church that keeps everything the same way. And that spirit of risk-taking, that entrepreneurial spirit, has continued all the way through the years. I remember in 1995, we were about to start the Praise Makers service, and people were genuinely worried. Even with these new people, we're still a relatively small church. What happens if everybody doesn't get to see everybody else on Sunday mornings? Incidentally, when we began the Praise Maker service, it was in January, right after Christmas, and we used to worship at 8:15 in the morning. It wasn't even light out at that point. We used to put a coffee pot at the back of the sanctuary. People would come to their seats with a coffee in their hands, and I would literally watch them wake up. Sometimes before the sermon. But it was new. It was all new. I remember a particular session meeting. It must have been in the mid-'90s, and we were having a discussion about inclusiveness in the church, in particular around the issue of sexual orientation. And for many around the table, that was a new and it was a very controversial subject for the church. There was a Presbyterian pastor from New York by the name of Janie Sparr, part of an organization called That All May Freely Serve, who was going to be coming to Detroit. And the question before us that night, sitting around the table, was, should she come and speak here at Greenfield? Not preach, but just speak. And I will never forget Jerry Church, one of our old members, turning to everyone and saying, well, I don't know if I agree with everything that this woman stands for, but I think we should hear what she says. And so we did. And that was the first of a number of programs we had. I will never forget the night we invited a group called PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, to come and share some of their experiences. And again, two of our older members, Bob and Betty Smith, lifelong Presbyterians. Bob was a Detroit fireman, retired Detroit fireman. And after the presentation was over, here are Bob and Betty crying their eyes out, surrounded by a group of caring Greenfielders. And Bob somehow managed to say through the tears, we've been Presbyterians our whole life, and I have never been able to say that our son is gay. It was a risk. And in 2003, when Greenfield's session overtured the Presbytery of Detroit to change our denomination's policy on who can and can't be ordained, and in 2004, when our own Lisa Doby went to Richmond, Virginia to speak to the General Assembly on our behalf, it didn't get less risky. This is about risking hands. The other thing I want to say about these many hands is that from the very beginning there has been a common understanding here that these hands are designed to reach out and not just reach in. In the mid-90s, we went through a visioning process. We called it Vision 2000. I wish I had time to tell you all about it because it was one of the most exciting things I've ever been a part of in the history of my time in the church. Once we realized that we were going to live, the question became, what are we living for? So we invited this outside consultant to come in, Roland Loop. He did all kinds of consulting with these big international companies. He knew nothing about life in the church. The process took 6 months. It all culminated one Saturday morning when we gathered downstairs in Fellowship Hall. We had to borrow easels. We had to borrow tables and chairs. Here were all these young consulting interns there to help us. Many hands filled with magic markers and pens and many brains brainstorming. And out of that process, we came up with 6 goals, which still are behind the basic philosophy of this congregation. And almost all of them were about reaching beyond the walls of this building. For example, to become an integral part of this community. To celebrate and promote diversity, not just in the church, but in the community. To intentionally minister to those Jesus called the least of these in our community. And so in 1992, we started the first Berkeley Crop Walk. So in 1993, we hosted SOS for the first time. Only 15 guests at that point. Now we host 30. So in 95, first time we went down to Crossroads Soup Kitchen with all of 16 volunteers. In 1997, we sent our first youth mission trip to Philadelphia. In 2000, Ruth Jones insisted that we start a health ministry team years later to be joined by Paula Robinson. In that same year, Stage called its first community youth minister. So in 2002, we got involved in Moses and were publicly involved in trying to push public transportation and decide what to do about urban sprawl. In 2004, we helped launch the Welcome In Day Center. And in 2009, we sent our first adult mission trip to Pittsburgh. somewhere along the line, we became more inclusive and we became handicap accessible. And somebody decided to put a note on the door as you go out into the world that says, servants entrance. Or as the bulletin puts it every week, the worship is over, the service begins. Many hands, willing to risk, committed to reaching out in his name. But always, first and foremost, it has been about the hand of God at work here and among us. The psalmist is right. If the Lord doesn't build the house, in vain do the builders labor. It reminds me of the story of the early church, which many of you have now learned so much about, having been through these Kerygma Bible studies. In the book of Acts, you run into all of these colorful characters, without which the church would have never been what it was. You run into Peter, who struggled with the issues of inclusiveness himself, and Paul, who of course founded many of those early churches. You find Philip, a new deacon who had to go against the teaching of the church back in Jerusalem and baptize an Ethiopian eunuch. You find Stephen, the great risk taker, the first Christian martyr. All over the pages are these colorful characters, but the book of Acts is not about any one of those. Who is the main character in the book of Acts? It's the Holy Spirit. 66 times in that one book, you hear about how the Spirit did this, or the Spirit moved so-and-so to do that. The Holy Spirit, the hand of God, at work here among us. So I never cease to love quoting St. Augustine, who said, without God, we humans cannot. But without us, God will not. And that, it seems to me, is the real story behind the last 20 years. One of the blessings about being involved in the community is that we've developed these wonderful relationships with our sister churches, and of course with Temple Emmanuel down in Oak Park. Rabbi Joan Klein, who's been teaching a great series on Genesis these last 6 weeks to a lot of us, tells a wonderful story from the Babylonian Talmud. This is how it goes. The Hebrews were making their escape from Egypt, and they came to the edge of the Red Sea. Looking across the water, they can see the hills of Sinai. They anticipate the freedom that waits for them there. Behind them, Pharaoh and his army are coming after them. They can hear the pounding of the horses, the clang of the bouncing chariots. They can see the dust rising, and it's getting closer. They turn to Moses, pleading for his help, looking to him to save them. Moses extends his staff over the sea. Nothing happens. He shakes it. Nothing. The people shout to him and at him with frightened cries. The sound of the horses and the chariots and Egyptian shouts gets louder, and the people push closer and closer to the water's edge. With the cries of the people in his head, Moses shakes his staff furiously, mumbles a few choice words of his own, but still, nothing happens. And over at the far edge stands Nachshon ben Aminadab. He hears the hoofbeats and the shouts. He sees the dust drawing closer. He looks at Moses, who is waving this stick over the water. And then at the distant shore where his freedom lies. And Nachshon says to himself, I'm not going back to Egypt. I'll not be a slave ever again. And he wades into the water. Now Nachshon can't swim. But he believes he has no choice. Freedom is calling him. So while the Israelites scream at Moses, Nachshon ben Aminadab wades into the sea. The water comes up to his knees. then to his hips, then to his chest, and then his chin. And when the water reaches his nose, God looks down and says, finally. Finally, here is one person who is ready and willing to risk everything for the sake of his freedom. And as the water reaches Nachshon's nose, God instantly splits the sea, and the Israelites cross to freedom. Without God, we humans cannot. But without us, God will not. The hand of God, working through many hands, hands willing to risk, hands committed to reaching out. Thanks for 20 great years. Here's to a few great more. And to God be the glory